the meeting, Simon? Okay. Anti-capitalist resistance would like to welcome everybody tonight to our meeting on Ireland, a centenary of counter-revolution, partition, and a divided working class. This year is the 100th anniversary of British imperialism's partition of Ireland, an event that created two corrupt, dysfunctional states in the country and divided its working class. Okay, anti-capitalist resistance invites you to explore the events leading up to the split, its consequences for the Irish working class, and whether there is any substance to claims of Irish unity in the near future. Our speakers tonight are Leah McQuade, who is a Belfast-born socialist and a member of anti-capitalist resistance, and Dr. William O'Brien, whose areas of interest, research interest are Irish cultural nationalism, the 19th century press in Britain and Ireland, Irish constitutional politics, and the role of physical force nationalism in Irish history. He will be addressing the struggle for independence in the late 19th century and then the War of Independence and Partition, and will round it off looking at the Boundary Commission, which drew up the frontier in Ireland between the two parts of the country. Liam McQuade will be speaking about the northern state and how that is sectarian, how this affected its working class, and discussing the current debates on a referendum and boundary poll and whether or not unity is likely in the imminent future. We'd like to begin with Dr. O'Brien. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. I presume you can all hear me. Excellent stuff. Good evening here from Dublin. And it's very nice to be here with you all this evening, and thank you for the invitation. I'll try and cover a fairly large area of time within, I think, about a quarter of an hour, I believe I have. I'll try and do as much as I can within that time frame. By necessity, I'm going to be painting a picture in very broad strokes, so a lot of nuance is going to be lost. So I may try and give more detail in any Q&A afterwards, if that's okay with people, yeah? Excellent stuff. Okay, I'll begin. Partition, I think, begins not really in 1921, but much further back, in the sense that I think partition is as much a state of mind as a fact of geography. And Liam may perhaps bring up some of this area himself when he speaks later. But I would be of the view that perhaps we can begin to take the story back, but I'll only do it very briefly, I've done it at the time, to the 17th century plantation of Ulster, when the Ulster Scots were brought in to Ulster to effectively rebuild or reimagine territory in a form that London was happy with. It was not going to be a Gaelic Irish area. It was going to be an area that would be modernized, be settled by Protestant settlers. It would have modern agriculture. It would be completely transformed. So what you have from the beginning is a settler population, which sees themselves under siege. And when you look at its experience in the 17th century, during the Cromwellian Wars and later Williamite Wars, they see themselves as a population under siege against a hostile Catholic population. And from that experience develops a Protestant tradition of resistance to Catholics, of fear of Catholics. And this, I think, is the ancestral intellectual belief underlay that is later going to be unionism. Similarly, during that same period in the 17th century, you also have a parallel Catholic tradition of dispossession, loss, cultural loss, whereby the old Catholic gentry, aristocracy, also earlier English settlers of Catholic faith were themselves removed, and the land structure, landholding pattern of Ireland completely transformed. So in the 17th century, you see a complete transformation of Ireland, where Catholics and Protestants come into conflict. And this is a process that I'm afraid continues from the 17th century through the 18th into the 19th century. During the 18th century, the new governing class in Ireland firmly established from the Williamite Wars of the late 17th century, establish themselves in Dublin, create a parliamentary system that suits them, but suits themselves only. Protestant dissenters, the ancestors of current Presbyterians, are excluded from civic and public life, along with Catholics. And these groups are actively discriminated against by the ascendancy in Dublin. And very briefly, during the 1798 Rising, they do come together. But unfortunately, sectarian divisions already present in Northern Ireland among the dissenting class and Catholics for land, etc., they come into conflict. And that breaks down. So the possibility of perhaps the two communities coming together in 1798 is lost. Going forward into the 19th century, you do see increasing divisions between the Protestant tradition and the Catholic traditions in Ireland. And that happens from 1800 onwards with the Act of Union, where Protestants then see themselves as perhaps linked constitutionally, socially, culturally, economically to the Union in Britain, and view any attempt at self-rule, self-government by Catholic majority in the country as a threat to their interests. 1800, you begin to see the beginnings maybe of Catholic mass democracy. And this is a peculiar phenomenon in Ireland in the 1800s, whereby the most illiberal institution in Europe, the Catholic Church, becomes a major mobilizing force in mass democracy. So O'Connell leads a mass Catholic population throughout the 1820s and 1830s with the first emancipation movement, and then a movement for the repeal of the Act of Union to bring the Parliament back to Dublin. Catholics are becoming a growing force, not just politically, but economically in the background as well, with the rise of a new Catholic middle class in the large urban areas of Ireland. Emancipation brings Catholics into office, into judiciary, and it's the beginning of a very gradual increase in the Catholic presence in the infrastructure of the 26 counties, what becomes the 26 counties, Ireland as a whole throughout the 19th century. How do Protestants react to that? In the Northeast, with alarm. In the South, among the aristocracy, the gentry, the land-holding class, anxiety also. So you either accept this development or you reject it. Or you have a middle way. You perhaps look for a compromise with which you can work with the Catholics. And this is where we have the Young Ireland movement of the 1840s. And what's created by particularly Thomas Davis is a constitutional nationalism, which is culturally based, which aims to bring Catholics and Protestants together. But unfortunately, in the post-famine period, that tradition is reinterpreted in a Catholic sense. And you begin to see the rise of a Catholic middle class and a mass Catholic readership, in fact, that prefer to look at their history, their culture, their identity through a Catholic lens. This is also one which is very much based in rural Ireland and the countryside and idealizes the peasant life and looks with suspicion on industrial societies, particularly in Britain itself, in England, but increasingly also in the Northeast. And in the post-famine period, with the rapid modernization of Irish society, one could see the two populations diverge increasingly from each other. So by the time you get to the late 1880s, the Northeast and the South and Southwest of Ireland are two very different societies. The Northeast is the industrial heartland of Ireland, shipbuilding in Belfast, for example. There's indeed a degree of deindustrialization in the south of Ireland, for example. People will be surprised to realize that my native city of Cork was, after Belfast up to 1860, the second major shipbuilding centre in Ireland, for example. The southwest becomes predominantly an agricultural state, with an increasing emphasis on the influence of a tenant farming class, who also tend to work with the Catholic Church to advance its interests. And the Catholic Church from the post-famine period rapidly becomes a presence in Irish life. It's a major presence in Irish education, and increasingly with the Liberals and later with nationalists, it becomes to influence the outcome of Irish political elections, locally and nationally, right up to the early 20th century. So 1885, and I'm hopping through this very rapidly, you have the first Home Rule Bill, which concentrates unionist minds. Certainly, all these developments where you see the growing influence of Catholic power in the South becomes a threat, and they create the Unionist Party to protect themselves. So you begin to see a reaction increasingly that sees Catholics as a threat and sees them as a threat to the industrial base of the North. And Rome Rule is equal to Home Rule. Similarly, Catholic nationalists really don't fail to appreciate Northern anxieties. The nationalism of the latter part of the 19th century is essentially one that nods towards inclusion of Protestants, but it refuses really to take unionism seriously as a distinct tradition with its own mythology, its own history. And what happens, I think, is a failure, a breakdown in communication between the two traditions, which feeds into the crisis in the early years of the 20th century with the third Home Rule Bill. The Irish Parliamentary Party, after the fall of Parnell, reunifies under John Redmond in about 1900. And it regains its position in Irish life pretty much. But it does so really with other organisations looking on, Sinn Féin under Arthur Griffith, and also, let's say, the growing socialist movement in Ireland as well. The thing is with Sinn Féin, it's a minority interest. It looks for industrial self-sufficiency, but its nationalism is that old sentimental one of Catholic perspective, of ourselves alone. It's very Anglophobic and very, very suspicious of Britain, and indeed embraces some of the other elements of the new nationalisms that emerged, for example, the Gaelic League, and sees an Irish culture, Irish language as a barrier to Anglicisation. But unusually, Griffith's interested in industrialisation, which sets him apart from the other nationalists of the time. Socialist movement in Ireland, and I'm really running through this very rapidly. The best thinker we produced was James Connolly. But Connolly produced a synthesis of Irish socialism where I think he reflected all too much some of the blind spots of Irish nationalism. He was faced with the problem of the Northeast. How do you explain the Northeast as a force of reaction? He began to see perhaps the Northern Unionists as a problem with his model of socialism. He saw the Orange Order as a reactionary force that was turning Protestant workers from working with the Catholic workers in Belfast and elsewhere to work for a socialist republic.
You have 3 minutes left.
Okay, I better go. Right, okay.
Okay.
Sorry about this.
That's no problem. I'm sorry.
As I say, anyway, 1910 onwards, the Liberals try to get Redmond on board to get themselves maintaining power. 1912, the Home Rule Bill is passed, but unfortunately, the Unionists are unhappy with that. So Redmond and co have to contend with a very unhappy Northern Ireland population who mobilise against it. Now, people can ask me questions at the end of this about that more, but generally speaking, what I'll try and do very rapidly is this. I think the big failing of nationalism in the South has been a failure to take into account, A, the Northern Unionist tradition and accept its own perspective in history. B, I think its rural emphasis and its idealization of the countryside and its demonizing of industrial society has blinded it to perhaps the contribution that perhaps socialism could make to a just society. And what happened, I think, was that failure contributed to the tensions that led up to the Anglo-Irish Civil War, the Anglo-Irish War, is 1919-1921, and then led to partition. So I let Liam speak now as best I can. There's a lot in this, I'm afraid. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we ask comrades please not to use the chat for chatting, but only to put up links for events? Thank you very, very much, Mr. O'Brien, Dr. O'Brien. Liam, are you ready?
Yeah, and yeah, I feel sorry for William because the Michael Collins argument alone normally takes about 3 hours and 6 pints. So we're compressing a huge amount into very short contributions. By way of a personal introduction, Simon, could I ask you to put on that second slide, the one that says a bit of family history? You'll need to listen close to this because the audio is not exactly Dolby standard. Next slide.
So what happened that you had to leave Belfast? We're getting the family history.
Right.
Yeah. So this was what, 21, 22?
Aye. At the time, then my mother had a different shop on the Governor Road,
Uh-huh.
the one direct.
Yeah.
And the Protestant woman come and tell her that they were going to burn her out
Yeah.
to warn her in the shop.
Okay, thanks, Simon.
So nobody was hurt?
No.
Right, so that was my uncle, and those of you who think that my accent can sometimes be a wee bit strong, never got to hear me Uncle Charlie. Now, what he was talking about there, that was recorded in 2006, and if you can put me back on the main screen, Simon, that was recorded in about 2006 when he was about 85, and what he was describing there was the reason his family was obliged to leave Belfast. His mother had a shop on a road that runs between the Falls Road and which is Catholic, Republican, and an area called Sandy Row, which is Loyalist. And yeah, at that time, there were significant pogroms. On the paternal side of the family, as you can hear, the family business was burned down. On my mother's side of the family, her father was a docker. And one of the things that happened in the build up to the creation of the Northern State was the expulsion of all the Catholic workers from the docks and the shipyards, plus what were called the rotten prods, which I think as socialists we define as those Protestant workers with a sufficiently high level of class consciousness to reject unionism, reject the imperialist ideology behind it, and the class collaboration behind Orangism. And I think I'm going to be disagreeing quite sharply at several points with what William has just said, and that's a good thing. There's no point discussing people that you agree with all the time. And for example, on the on that fundamental question, Liam, why is it a Protestant Catholic thing? What I would add to William's introduction to that was that when the British settled in Ireland, the bit that held out longest, that offered the most resistance, was what's now called Ulster in the north. And this pacification strategy there was the settlement of small farmers. In the south, it was much more a landed gentry that emerged. Kate Hoey is big pals with them. But what that meant was that a tenant farmer, quite prosperous by Irish standards, developed. And by the late 18th century, these people were influenced, some of these people were influenced by the American Revolution and of course by the French Revolution, and they began mobilizing against control from London. So to use a 20th, 21st century term, the revolutionary vanguard in the late 18th century was a section of the northern Protestant bourgeoisie. They had arisen in alliance with sections of the Catholic peasantry, which was very brutally dealt with. This revolutionary vanguard, as revolutionary vanguards tend to be, was very much a minority. Other loyalist tenant farmers mobilized into what's called the Orange Order, and this is where I would sharply disagree with William. It was expressly set up as a counter-revolutionary formation to smash the Catholic peasantry, to smash that radical Protestant tradition. Now, those tenant farmers, being a bit more affluent, accumulated capital, which means that the Belfast area did begin to industrialize. Flax, linen, that developed into shipbuilding, as William said. And a consequence of the failure of the rebellion was the passing of the Act of Union, which meant that these Irish industries in the north had full access to the common market of the British state, which allowed it to become more prosperous. So with the lifting of trade restrictions, Belfast, within 100 years, from 1800 to 1900, its population exploded massively from 20,000 to 350,000. And as you heard me Uncle Charlie say, well, what he says later in that wee clip is that lots of Catholics from the urban areas, or sorry, from the rural areas came into the city. Lots of Protestants come in as well. And the essential sectarian geography of the city was established at that point, from the 1820s onwards. And I see my sister-in-law Angela is here. That is starting to change in Belfast. So areas like South Belfast are now essentially middle-class Catholic areas. The Protestant middle classes haven't moved out. Now, the workforce that was recruited into heavy industry was predominantly Protestant, right? Harland and Wolff, the big shipbuilder, about 7% of its workforce were Catholic in a city where about 25% of the population was Catholic. And one of the things I've been doing for the since lockdown started, if you've been in meetings with me, you'll sometimes see me looking a wee bit distracted. It's because I've been reading the British and Irish papers from 100 years ago this week, and I've been running a wee Twitter thing. But what really strikes you is how militantly sectarian the working class Protestant organizations were, and I'll be coming up with some quotes about that later. And that culminated, of course, in the 1920 expulsions of class-conscious Protestant workers and all the Catholic workers. And this would include people who'd fought in the British Army during the First World War. They had their military medals and, they'd fought at the Somme, Thiepval, and all the rest of it. That service to the empire, which is a huge part of current unionist mythology, was completely disregarded. Now, why is it that the historic province of Ulster, of 9 counties, did not become the state, which is, I've skipped a few slides there. Sam, could you skip on to slide 5? I'm not looking at my own notes closely enough. Right, so, yeah, right. This is what I'm saying about this is from a unionist labour organisation, and you can see, anyway, the slide that I was going to show you there was a clip which says that we don't want Catholics and we don't want Bolshevists, we don't want red flag men. Right. This was very much the ideology. Just pause on that. What you're seeing there is, that's from the Daily Mirror in 1920. That's the expulsion of Catholic workers and Protestants from the shipyards. You can see that they're being chased by a British Army vehicle and lots of the shipyard workers. So, the state was very much a part of that. Anyway, back to the historic Ulster thing. Slide 5, please, Simon. Yeah, so William Craig went on to become the first Prime Minister. Yeah, I think it was the first Prime Minister. He became Prime Minister of the Northern State. And what he told his audience at one of these meetings was, if we go for the 9 counties, we're going to be outnumbered. If we go for a smaller 6-county state, there'd be 600,000 of us, 300,000 of them. And even though these people are filthy and breed like rabbits, that's going to secure us a permanent majority. As it turns out, one of the side effects of the reactionary family teaching on contraception has been a slightly higher Catholic growth rate. Okay, you can, if you put on slide 6, Simon. Okay, so what happened was right, in response to the Home Rule movement, which was essentially the SDLP of the time, the Social Democratic and Labour Party, organising, and a mass movement against British imperialism, but in favour of a constitutional nationalist settlement pre-First World War One. Unionists started importing guns from Germany. So a few months before World War One started, Unionists were importing German guns. They were drilling militias, giving them military training. Now, the War of Independence was mostly fought in the south, right? A lot of activity in Dublin, a lot of activity in the Cork area, in Kerry, and so on. Very, very, well, relatively little, comparatively speaking, in the north. That was partly because of the huge imbalance of forces, because the Unionists had these armed militias. After the end of the war, you had vast numbers of men with military training coming back. You had also a very, very large police force and a strong military presence as well. So the North had become a Unionist armed camp, supplied with state-of-the-art weapons by the British. The resistance in the North was garden shed stuff, it was shotguns stolen from farmers, that type of thing.
Liam, you have 5 minutes left. 5
right.
minutes.
Okay, this is going to be, okay. In that case, I'll say something briefly about how the Northern state developed. First election in the Northern state, what we now call Stormont, the Unionists won 40 seats, Sinn Féin and the Nationalists won 6 each. For a period that this hokey-cokey of boycott, participate, and that's a pattern that's lasted. But liberal and leftist commentators at the time said that the Northern state had as much in common with Mussolini's England, or Mussolini's Italy, than a democratic society like England. If you put up slide 9 there, Simon, there was a Special Powers Act which essentially said if a police officer thinks you're thinking a disloyal thought, he can arrest you. Right, the state had carte blanche to arrest and detain people for as long as they wanted, and that was famously adopted as a model by the South Africans during the apartheid period. In that whole time, not a single Catholic served in the Northern States government until it collapsed 50 years later. As a side note, the Irish left, the revolutionary left, virtually didn't exist apart from tiny handfuls of people in the North. The Communist Party and the Labour Party essentially capitulated to unionism. And this was a very vicious unionism. So Brooke, who became Prime Minister, said, I have not a Roman Catholic about my place. The Labour Minister said, yes, there is one Catholic working in my department, but he's a temp, and we're going to be getting rid of him quite soon. That was the ethos of the place. Now, where are we now? The thing about the big movements in Irish history is they're always connected with what happens internationally. So the United Irishmen in the 18th century, that was under the influence of the French, the American revolutions. The events in '68, that was what was happening in the United States and in France. That movement that opened up in '68 has been defeated. And a movement has been ideologically defeated when it was set up for the express purpose of smashing the state, and now it's the junior partner in an administration with a very right-wing party, the Democratic Unionist Party. Do I think this talk of, you can get rid of that slide, Simon. Do I think this talk of unity in the imminent future is justified? Absolutely not, no. Why do we know this? Well, earlier in the week, Micheál Martin, the Free State Taoiseach, said a referendum over my dead body. Boris Johnson said a referendum over my dead body. Arlene Foster, the DUP leader, said a referendum over my dead body. The numbers are very finely balanced, and the support for Irish unity in the south is, if memory serves, even more flimsy than it is in the north. If you've got a revolutionary state, a counter-revolutionary state, it's inevitable that it's going to have a counter-revolutionary ideology. So the central point of difference I think I have with William is that unionism, loyalism, Orangism are explicitly anti-working class reactionary ideologies. Socialists in Ireland and socialists who support the Irish working class have to call it by its right name and accept that no compromise is possible with it. That our demand remains that for a workers' republic. Sorry, that was rather compressed, but I'm sure other comrades will take up some of the themes. I can see one or two I know will be champing at the bit.
We're opening the meeting up for discussion. Would anybody like to say anything, ask a question, raise a point of disagreement or agreement? Joseph, please. 3 minutes, if that's okay. I'll take a short list and then we'll come back to the speakers so they can respond. Okay?
Yes, I'd just like to put a question to Liam, but also to William, I think. Diarmaid Ferriter, who's regarded as one of the leading Irish historians at the moment, wrote in his book, The Border, The History of Partition. And there's a lot there about correspondence between the Northern Unionists and London and the government in Dublin and various attempts to have sort of cross-border initiatives and all the rest. But one of the arguments running through the book is that the British government in London essentially took a neutral position regarding the reunification of Ireland, and that there are several briefings from the Foreign Office and so on to Dublin saying, you know, we essentially have no interest. The matter is that we cannot act without unionist support, but if there was unionist agreement, in other words, if there was some sort of pan-Irish agreement, we wouldn't stand in the way. Now, I think this is interesting in the sense of economic history because, you know, as Liam said, if we look at 1921, and I've been to visit the old dockyards in Belfast, I mean, it was a powerhouse of industry, shipbuilding, engineering, the linen industry, and all the rest. It was a very important economic zone. But as time has progressed, you know, it's become a deindustrialized area and is now one of the poorest, in fact, the poorest region of the UK. So there is a sort of economic argument there. There is, you know, many commentators have said that essentially, whereas London regards Scotland as central to the UK state, it does not have the same attitude towards the north of Ireland. And there's also the issue of, you know, the class connections between the old form of unionism, you know, the landed gentry and so on, who ran the Unionist Party and who had strong connections with, and we mustn't forget, the Conservative and Unionist parties, the full title. I mean, Theresa May, I think, was a genuine unionist in the old-fashioned sense, and actually said that, I think, on her first speech outside Downing Street. Hence, you know, why her Brexit plan was very cognizant of taking along the unionists with her. Of course, the ironic thing is the unionists then stabbed her in the back. But there is this argument in Ferriter's book that the British government essentially don't have an interest. Now, John Major specifically came out and said this, and said that, you know, British government will not stand in the way. So I wanted to put that to both Liam and William. So, you know, is do you think there is a genuine economic and political interest in London? I mean, Dominic Cummings again said, I don't care if Northern Ireland falls into the sea. Is there a genuine interest in London, you know, and going back several decades, as Ferreter shows, or is it, you know, would they be quite happy, in your opinion, if there was some way they could detach the North from letting it go?
Thank you, Joseph. Terry?
Yes. Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to kind of respond to that. I haven't read the book that Joseph's talking about, but I think it's a real mistake to look at the interests of the British state and British imperialism primarily from an economic point of view. I think it's about politics and power. I mean, I remember I suppose that the point at which it was starkest for me was during the hunger strikes, while Thatcher and the Tories were completely prepared to preside over deaths in their jails to preserve the idea of the Union and to batter that struggle into the ground very literally, despite the fact that it was actually quite a dangerous thing to do at points of that struggle, I think. I also think to separate Scotland and Ireland in the way that Joseph sort of tended to, I mean, yes, Scotland contains elements of the bourgeoisie that went to the south with partition in Ireland, but I think the role of Orangism and Unionism in Scottish politics is also something that shouldn't be downplayed. But I guess, and then finally, my other question to Liam, and I know you had very little time, but what do you think is the attitude of young people growing up since the Good Friday Agreement, and how is what's been going on in Belfast over the last few weeks playing with that generation in terms of people who've not seen petrol bombs on a consistent basis as earlier generations have done?
Thank you, Terry. I have Roland, and then I'm going to return to the speakers. Since they had such limited time, this will give a chance for them to speak some more. So thank you, Roland.
Yes, I was very struck by something that Joseph said. I didn't catch the name, but it was a politician who said that he wouldn't mind if Northern Ireland fell into the sea, because that immediately brought to mind Israeli Prime Minister Rabin, who said in the mid-90s that he wished he could wake up in the morning and read that Gaza had drowned in the sea, but since it hadn't, Israel had to come to some sort of agreement with the Palestinians. Because it seems to me that is yet one more echo of, one more reminder of the way in which the conflict in Palestine echoes the conflict in Ireland. In 1917, Britain occupied Palestine as part of the First World War. And shortly afterwards, Ronald Storrs, who was appointed as the first military governor of Jerusalem, said at a dinner party that Britain supported Zionism because they hoped to create in Palestine a little loyal Jewish Ulster in the heart of a sea of potentially hostile Arabism. It's very clear that Britain knew and very consciously was fostering Ulster as a way to prevent Irish unity and Irish independence and the control of the Irish people over their land and their resources, in the same way that they were fostering the Zionist movement in the Middle East to thwart not only Palestine, but Arab nationalism in general. And I think this has been a consistent, and then afterwards, Britain imported a lot of the British police that they took over to Palestine. They took the Black and Tans over to Palestine to enforce British occupation there. One of Liam's slides referred to the Special Powers Act, and the Special Powers Act was then introduced into the Palestine administration as the Defense Emergency Regulations, which are still, Israel still enforces. Israel justifies all of its actions in the occupied territories now under the Defense Emergency Regulations, which were originally British regulations against Irish nationalism. I mean, there's a whole way that we need to see the way in which across the empire, Britain used divide and rule. The stories that Liam told about the expulsion of Catholics from Belfast echo the expulsion of Palestinians in 1948. The account that William told of the fostering of intercommunal and interreligious dissent before the physical partition echoes what was happening in Palestine, where centuries of harmony were disrupted both by the Zionist movement and by the British Empire. And I think we have to see Ireland as part of a pattern of British imperialism and British divide and rule across the world. And I mean, Liam's heard me say this before, but every time he speaks about Ireland, I think about Palestine and what Britain did in Palestine. This meeting has reinforced this even more. I think the echoes are striking.
Thank you, Roland. I'd like to return to both William and Liam and see if they'd like to go. Liam, would you like to go first? So would William like to go first?
Very briefly, I don't see myself as the voice of Belfast youth, Terry. Well, I haven't done for quite a while. But I mean, what I think you have to differentiate what you mean by Belfast youth. Right. What we're seeing is that in some of the loyalist areas, people are relearning things that their grandparents and great-grandparents did. You know, look at those papers from 1920-21. You know, that you see photographs there of 6-year-old kids, you know, taking part in the riots, and it's almost as if there's a folk memory being handed down. And I think, you know, the history of Belfast, the history of the North, actually, there's this horrible continuity of violence and pogroms. So, you know, you heard what happened to my grandparents. Yeah, we had to move out of our house in a mixed area in North Belfast because of a murder attempt on my mother and all the rest of it. So yeah, it's like every 30-40 years this thing comes to the surface, and if you create a sectarian unstable state, I think that's inevitable. That's particularly true in the working class areas, where and what we've been seeing in the loyalist working class areas is that young people very much in the grip of this reactionary neo-fascist ideology are taken to the streets around stuff they don't really understand, other than the fact that they hate Fenians. Are the Brits neutral? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. You know, during the War of Independence, as I said, you know, the Republicans were stealing farmers' shotguns, smuggling small amounts of munitions in from the United States and Europe. The Loyalists were being armed by the British government, right? You know, consignments of British weapons. That's not the act of a neutral arbiter. And, you know, there's that famous Lloyd George quote to Collins about immediate and terrible war. But again, in the press of the period, senior British politicians say the whole way through, we will fight you to a standstill if you hold out for an Irish Republic. The absolute bottom line is you have to join the Commonwealth. That was the deal that Collins settled on. And I think Terry's right. Yeah, it's partly about economics, but it's partly about ideology. And, you know, I did another meeting last night on Brexit, and one of the points I made there is this is the most right-wing Tory administration we've seen in a very long time. Part of that Orban, Putin, Modi shift to the right internationally. That British nationalist identity is central to its programme. They are not a neutral arbiter in any way. No, and it's only going to be the action of the Irish working class that defeats British imperialism in Ireland, not referenda, not the goodwill of the British government.
Thank you, Liam. William?
Yeah, there's a few things to address. I suppose I could begin with the first question. I think going on what Joseph was kind of the point he was making. Will London cut Ulster loose? I can never really, in my own mind, decide what will happen there. You know, it tends to vary what I read in the papers, what I hear politicians say. If you'd asked me, let's say 10, 20 years ago, would I see United Ireland, I would have said no. I take the point Liam made that the support for a United Ireland in the South right now is quite low. But you could have a horrible scenario which nobody would like, in the sense that Brexit could cause the United Kingdom to fracture. And you could see Scotland go its own way, but you could also see perhaps Ulster go its own way. You could perhaps see a scenario where perhaps, you know, a future assembly elect maybe a Sinn Féin stroke nationalist majority, and perhaps they may agitate to get out, and maybe the British government then may decide in that scenario that, well, let's cut our losses and leave. And we'd probably have a public opinion in the United Kingdom, or what might indeed be left of it at that stage, that would say, well, you know, we're not particularly bothered either. So I think you're going to see the familiar pattern with British history and British imperial history, whereby when a territory, you hold on to a territory so long as it's strategically and, more importantly, symbolically useful. But then when that becomes rather difficult to maintain, then you'll cut your losses and run. And I do think the partition, getting back to partition, was a prelude to what happened to the rest of the British Empire. You know, I think you could almost see what happened in Ireland in 1919-22 as a dress rehearsal for what happened in India and the partition of India. And again, the conflict between Hindus, Muslims, which led to the creations of Pakistan and the Republic of India. And it's ironic, in fact, that when you look at the 1921 Anglo-Irish Treaty and the negotiations leading up to it, that De Valera had hoped for a compromise, what he called external association, whereby within a Commonwealth imperial structure, you would have a republic, or a republican type constitution. That was rejected by the British out of hand. And after the agreement, after the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed, Collins attempted to create a new constitution in May 1922, which was very republican, but again, the British rejected that. But it's ironic that they seem to have learned from what 1921-22 and happily accepted a republican constitution for India, and that was the model going forward for many of the new territories. So I think, yeah, as regards to the current problems in Northern Ireland, I would agree with Liam. I think a lot of the old arguments are being dredged up. I think the biggest problem in Irish history, in my opinion, has always been, and I would imagine Liam might disagree with me, but you have the two opposing camps of unionism and nationalism. I think each is very often blind to the other. I think Northern Unionists have never really accepted the reality that a majority population of the island of Ireland had certain rights, had certain goals that were legitimate, and they should have been acknowledged and respected. On the nationalist side, I think allowing for some of the issues that Liam brought up, or of, let's say, anti-Catholicism, I think Irish nationalists have been more interested in gestures towards Protestants rather than actual, genuine, engaged dialogue. And very often, I think there's not been a real attempt to appreciate unionism as a tradition itself. Okay, for a Catholic nationalist from those of us in the South, my own self often included, it there are certain elements of it I find difficult to deal with, but it is a genuine historical, political, sociological, cultural phenomenon that Irish nationalists have to address and negotiate with. And that also includes those on the left as well. To go back to Irish nationalism, one of its other failings, with the great exception of James Connolly, has been it's never really been an ideology compatible with left-wing politics. As I said, with the Davis-like nationalism in the 19th century, it's looked at the countryside as an ideal, been very suspicious of industrial societies, which is identified with England, and it's an integral part of its Anglophobia, you know, and that translates into the North and its own industrial society, and that then feeds, unfortunately, into the conflicts between unionism and nationalism in the South. So I don't know, as I say, if people want to add anything to that, observations, go ahead, I'll be good, you know.
Thank you very much. I see Jerry Ruddy. Does anyone else like to speak? Can you raise your hand? Okay. Well, meanwhile, why don't you begin? Ah, excellent. I see another person. Thank you, Jerry, then David. Oh, you need to unmute. 1 minute. There you go. You need to unmute. Oh, no. Oh, God.
Oops. Oh dear. I'm lost here.
You need to open the video. There you go. Sorry
Go.
about that. We had a
Right,
little.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I must apologise. I'm from South Belfast, middle class Catholic. We've taken over. I'm sorry about that. Apologise, but my parents were evicted from Lisburn, outside of Lisburn, in the 1920s, and it was interesting to hear when you were talking about 1790s. You actually referred to Northern Ireland, and if you go back over, you'll hear that. And we also had the I newspaper talking about Northern Ireland in the 1850s, 1560s. It didn't exist, and that there's a mentality with that that resists having that reality. Northern Ireland did not exist. There was, during the 18th, 19th century, a gradual process of Belfast from the early 1800s, sectarianism. It existed from 1814, existed from 1830, 34, 35, right on through, that there was always this imperialist reaction to nationalism. And nationalism itself eventually became what we now define as the 1848 nationalism. That was never republicanism. Republicanism was something that differentiated itself from that. From 1798, Irish republicanism was a universal liberty, equality, eternity. It was the conflict between Burke and, what do you call him, the Adam, I think it was Adams, can't remember his name.
Tom Paine.
Yeah, that was, and that is still the question today, because you still have that differentiation between republicanism and thing. Now, to say that Sinn Féin and all the rest of them, it's not for me to define Sinn Féin republicanism. That's their business. But I do not see how that can be related to what Tom Paine was about, what the people in the Republican struggle over many, many years fought about. I can't see it, but there you go. On the other hand, I think it needs to be reflected that you need to take into account the unionist position. That's difficult. It's difficult for nationalists, it's difficult for Republicans. But those guys who are going out at the minute in working class Protestant communities, they don't know what this is about. And that is a problem. Some of them do, some of their leadership, and they have a very clear thing, and we need to respect it. But working class Protestants, they haven't a clue as to what is going on. They come out with the phraseology, with the thing about independence. It doesn't work. Alternatively, we have to ask the question, what are Irish Republicans going to offer to these people? What kind of society will it be in the future? That, to me, is critical. And maybe there is some way that you can devise without alienating them. And that is a very big question. So anyway, thanks very much.
Thank you, Jerry. The next person we have is David, and then Declan. We have Mercedes has asked to speak as well as Kieran. So what I can try to do is do a short list and then shift people over. But let's see. Let me just let David. Do you please go? Your turn.
You know, although I was born in England and have lived in England all my adult life, very proud of my Irish heritage, as was my father. I think his grandparents were both from Northern Ireland, and I don't know all the detail, it was a long time ago, but it was something to do with something around the fact that a Catholic woman and a Protestant man getting together and having to emigrate to Scotland and somehow work their way down to the south of England. But the point I wanted to make was, it was sort of following on from, or question really for both speakers, following from William's point about the possibility of a Sinn Féin-led government in the north. And one thing that's interested me over the last 20, 30 years is the changing sort of face of electoral politics, both in the north and the south. I mean, you know, Sinn Féin is now a very, very significant force in the north. I mean, whereas 30, 40 years ago, it would have been the SDLP, would have been the main nationalist party. And in the south, again, there's a shift. You know, I actually got in conversation with somebody on Twitter last week who lives in Ireland, who said, you know, that Fianna Fáil are on their way out. I mean, they're certainly not the force they were, because they're now in a coalition with Fine Gael, whereas they were the dominant party, and Sinn Féin are polling very, very well in the south. And is that process going to continue? Is there going to be a situation where, over a period of years, Sinn Féin could be the dominant force both in the north and the south? And also, if the speakers could say a little bit about Sinn Féin and where they are now, and they've clearly made the link to electoral politics. But where are they in terms of how high a priority for them is Irish unity? Is it high on their agenda?
Thank you very much, Declan. Wait, you have to unmute.
Apologies. Is that okay?
That's perfect. Yeah.
Right. Just quickly in response to what David's just said, I know quite a few people active in Sinn Féin in Ireland, and I call them New Sinn Féin these days because it seemed to be going through the sort of metamorphosis that Tony Blair led in changing the Labour Party, but maybe that's time for another discussion. But I just want to make a few brief points. I'm convinced by the argument that Britain had an objective interest in the partition of Ireland, and it was an interest at the time, and for all sorts of strategic and economic reasons to do with security, NATO, the economy, Northern Ireland was important. I am not convinced that that's still the case, so I'd welcome the views of Liam and William on that, because it seems to me that Northern Ireland no longer plays that role in British politics. The other thing I wanted to mention views on, it seems as it seems to me likely, there is another referendum in Scotland, and if Scotland goes independent, that is could have a crucial impact in Northern Ireland, because the Ulster Loyalist identification has always been this Ulster Scots business, you know, and and I think that will fatally, to some extent, fatally undermine unionism in that part of Ireland. So I welcome views on that. But the other thing is, I mean, I've always thought the Conservatives, I'm not saying admire is the right word, but they're a much more ruthless bunch of bastards than the Labour Party ever was. And they'll quite happily shaft anybody. I mean, it looks to me that Boris Johnson has shafted the unionists to a certain extent with the protocol, which partially explains the answer. So, you know, so I wouldn't be at all surprised if the Conservatives decided that Northern Ireland, I think it was, I can't remember who you quoted as saying, but for a lot of Ulster British Conservatives, Northern Ireland is, you know, not important. They could happily get rid of it tomorrow. And the final thing I would like views on, I'm sorry, it may not be time to do all this, is I don't think it's enough to argue for United Ireland. I think what those of us on the left have to argue for a completely new sort of Ireland. And what sort of Ireland should that be? So it's not a question of Northern Ireland being absorbed in the South, even though I still prefer that to having grown up in Belfast to the status quo. But I think we need to argue for a different sort of Ireland, an Ireland which has at least the possibility of uniting the working classes on both sides of the border.
Thank you, Declan. I'm going to return now to William and Liam, and then I'm going to do the next list, which at the moment is Mercedes, Kieran, Dave Landau, and John O'Brennan. Okay? So if Liam and could respond, there you go, and William. You
Okay.
first this time.
I'm not going to reply to everything. Just to develop something that Jerry said about the nature of the two ideologies historically and actually at the moment, look at their international points of reference. Republicanism has always identified with what would call progressive causes. So you go to West Belfast, the murals are all about Palestine, the Basque Country, Malcolm X, Black Lives Matter, that type of thing. And has always aligned itself with radical movements internationally. Unionism always takes the wrong side of an argument. Pro-apartheid, more Zionist than many Zionists. The Israeli state is a huge point of reference for it as well. On the evolution of Sinn Féin, I think the first couple of times I voted in elections, I voted for them. I wouldn't dream of doing that now. When you're in a coalition government with a reactionary party of the nature of the Democratic Unionist Party, then that makes you beyond the pale for socialists, as far as I'm concerned. We wouldn't call for a vote for a Social Democratic Party that was going into alliance with the Christian Democrats in Germany, for example. So it has evolved. It's made its peace with partition. It's made its peace with the southern state as well. It's on its march through the institutions, and it's become professionalized. It's become very, very corrupt. I know somebody works in the social housing body in Belfast, and what he tells me is that if you're tied in enough with the Republican leadership in Belfast, you shoot up to the top of the housing list and stuff the family with 3 kids and mold on the bedroom walls. Right? I think for socialists, it's not any longer a legitimate, supportable option, which I think means that as socialists, and this is going on from what Declan says, yes, the Ireland that we are arguing for is a socialist republic, Connolly's phrase, the workers' republic. I think I addressed, though, the point about whether or not the Brits want to remain. Yes, and I think as much as anything now, it's ideological, and I think particularly if Scotland has some sort of soft, hard separation from the British state, clinging on to Wales and the 6 counties are going to take on a huge ideological significance. As for the Ulster Scots thing, I mean, my Uncle Charlie that you heard there, yeah, if he was still alive today, he would get a grant for being a native Ulster Scots speaker. You know, it's essentially that rural accent from the Belfast hinterland. And yeah, it's a confection of fairly recent vintage. Yeah, the loyalism is essentially the ideology of you know, the working class of the urban 6 counties.
Go ahead, William.
Okay, again, I'll give my tuppence worth on some of this. I think for Sinn Féin, I think Irish unity is very high on the agenda. Yeah, I think that's something they'll never abandon, really. I liked the observation that of one of the speakers just now of calling Sinn Féin New Sinn Féin. I think it's a very apt description of them, because under Mary Lou MacDonald, and indeed before she became leader of Sinn Féin, they became very adept at rebranding themselves as a political party of the left that would appeal to a younger voting base, you know, and they've done that particularly in the South. I always thought it significant that among the Republican prisoners and the Loyalist prisoners in Northern Ireland, it's been said by people that whereas the Loyalist lads were in the gym working out, the Republican prisoners were doing courses in media studies in the Open University. And that has paid off, actually. For the most part, they're quite media savvy, notwithstanding the cock-up of the last couple of days with their database material. You know, they've been using private information from people from the electoral register in a database called ABU, if I remember its name correctly, which they've relocated to Germany. And that's raised some awkward questions. And it's taken them several weeks to reply to those questions, actually. But for the most part, they never seem to put a foot wrong. And when it comes to running candidates at both local and general elections, they seem to be adept at running attractive, younger-looking candidates. So the whole idea is that they're fresh, new. They've been aided at that, certainly, by Fianna Fáil's decline. Fianna Fáil, I think of the financial crisis back in 2009-10, they lost credibility a lot here. And they seem to be in decline. Fine Gael seems a bit wobbly to me. And it is interesting that the fact that both parties, descendants of the two groups that were slugging it out during the Civil War of 1922-23, are now in coalition together. There's a great deal about their current electoral fortunes. And Sinn Féin now is the main party of opposition. I would never have seen that myself 20, 25 years ago. So I think, yeah, I think they're a force to be reckoned with. And I mean, they take the unity thing very seriously, you know. If I give you a little anecdote on that. I was on the DART, which was kind of a light rail system here in Dublin a little while ago. This is pre-COVID. And I was earwigging one of their HR people, one of their, oh my God, their PR people, just telling people how important the whole unity thing was to get out there with their people who were listening to them on the media and so on. People should be a little quieter when they're in public, I reckon. As I said, as regards Ulster Scots identity and so on, and the whole Scottish independence movement, I think if Scotland were to become independent, I'd agree. I think it would certainly lead, I think, in my opinion, to pressure for some form of referendum, either for a border poll or indeed for Northern Ireland to go alone. How that would go, I don't know. As regards what shape a future Ireland should take, I certainly think what we could do if you want to have a united Ireland, I would suggest perhaps we have a federal republic type system whereby you incorporate the Ulster provinces into a provincial system whereby you have a provincial assembly responsible for a lot of its own local autonomy. Let's say beefed up local government, shall we say, but you extend that across all of the island to Munster, Leinster, Connacht as well. and we create a kind of a federal republic, and perhaps you'd have local elections to have regional assemblies in each of these areas, perhaps. I don't know. That might perhaps give them some identity, perhaps. I don't know if that would work. And that's just an idea floating right now. As regards the Socialist Republic, that's always an ideal of everybody on the left. And we'll be fighting vested interests for a couple of generations yet on that score. I suspect something like my federal model of a republic might be a far more achievable bet, perhaps, than that, I'm afraid. But that's my own opinion on that.
Thank you. The next people I have are Mercedes, Kieran, Dave Lando, and John O'Brennan. Mercedes, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and forgive me for the audacity of asking questions. I'm only asking questions because I'm not even English. Definitely I'm not Irish, but I'm not even English. I'm Spanish. I'm a radical Spanish person, and the oppressed support the oppressed. So Spain has always had a soft spot for Ireland. I shout at my family when they talk about the United Kingdom. I say, no, it is Great Britain, because the British shouldn't be in Ireland. This is my, if you like, emotional understanding or position regarding Ireland. So I'm going to ask questions for my own education, but maybe because questions from the outside might help you kind of tune yourselves to the outside as well. I was very surprised to see the uprising, current uprising in Belfast. And I thought that actually the Protestants, the loyalists, have the upper hand, so they don't need to cause trouble because they have it in their hands. And my idea was that the British, maybe English, kind of the Tory England, wants to divert attention from the chaos of the country and from the corruption that we are seeing in this country. So that would be one question. The other one would be, again, naively, if Scotland were to leave the Union, would Northern Ireland want to join them? And yet, I think of the rivalries. We humans are very prone to rivalries, and how would they fit in? How would Northern Ireland fit in a kind of a joint union with Scotland? So these are my questions, really.
Thank you. Kieran?
Yeah, I have a question probably mainly for Liam. If you rewind back to 1919, and the big strike in Belfast, which involved the engineering trades, which not entirely, but were primarily Protestant memberships, went to some great high points, like running the gas and the water themselves and so on, and they experienced this strike as part of an upsurge by the British working class, right? So the same thing going on in Glasgow and other shipbuilding centres around and so on. But ultimately, it didn't win. I know they got some reduction in the hours, but it didn't win. The army went into the streets in Glasgow. The strikers went back to work in Belfast. Now, to what extent do you think the impact of that strike defeat weakened the class consciousness of the people who had taken part in it, thereby leaving them more kind of amenable or open or fertile ground when the likes of the Unionist Labour Association and the Imperial Guard and so on came along to communalise things in 1920. So like that kind of disappearance of class consciousness, and then parachuting back to the modern day where you've now got a largely deindustrialized Britain and the North. What are the prospects for radicalization among the Protestant working class that would break them away from unionism?
Thank you. Dave Landau?
Yes, hi. My question is really about the emergence and success of movements around sexual politics, the politics of sexuality and gender, particularly around abortion and around gay marriage, and the impact of that on these questions, and in particularly making the idea of a united Ireland a more attractive proposition than it perhaps was 5 years ago.
Thank you. John O'Brennan.
Thank you very much indeed. I appreciate the opportunity. I want to thank Liam firstly and William for their excellent contributions. It's particularly great to catch up with William, who's an old friend of mine. Just something on the perspective from the Republic. I hold the chair in European integration at Maynooth University. I've been deeply involved in what you might call mitigating the effects of Brexit on the Republic. I'm a member of the group that advises our Minister for Foreign Affairs over the last years. And I've been involved in lots of discussions in recent weeks and months about the future of the island. And there is a dynamism, I think, about those talks. But the big question that everybody has to grapple with is the one that William, I think, was pointing to in his last comments, which is about the shape of a future Ireland. The simple fact is there is a very large group of people who will never be reconciled with the idea of being part of United Ireland. So the danger is that in any such future construction of that kind, we just invert the problem that Northern Ireland experienced after 1921, which is that a very large minority does not want to be part of this state. So anybody who is in power, whether in Northern Ireland or in the Republic, has got to grapple with this. And to Liam, I would say I disagree with you somewhat, although I'm entirely non-political. The Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, I think, is deeply committed to making the Good Friday Agreement work. He is, I think, very conscious that if you were to hold a referendum at any point in the near future, not only would that referendum not succeed in Northern Ireland, it would not succeed in the Republic. And you would set back the cause by a very, very long period of time. And in fact, if you speak to Sinn Féin representatives in Dublin, privately, they're of the same view, that it is too much of a risk. Why would you imagine that a referendum result in Northern Ireland, which produced, for example, a 52-48 majority, would solve the problem for you? It couldn't, and it wouldn't. And we would end up back in exactly the situation that Northern Ireland was in. So from our perspective, the only future is one that is symbolized by the Good Friday Agreement. It is interdependence, it is cross-community cooperation, all the different forms that that can take. And it would be great, I believe, if we could stop talking about the Constitution, stop talking about constitutional endpoints, and think about how communities can actually help each other. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. John, Mian?
Yeah, just on, I think we should look at the actual figure in terms of what the state of people's opinion is, both north and south of the border. Now, the BBC actually did an opinion poll this week, and it showed north of the border, it was in favour of keeping partition by 48 to 43%. Now, it should be noted that that is a decreasing share of the unionist majority in the north. That's been a trend, and it's continuing. The statement John O'Brennan just made about what the figures are in the south is simply wrong. The BBC did their poll, this week, asked the same question to people in the south, and it was 51 for ending partition and 27 against. Now, in terms of the dynamic of the thing, I think it's very important to understand that the vast majority of the nationalist population in the north rejects the state they are living in. That's just plain fact. And the first democratic question that has to come is, if they want a referendum, should they be entitled to have it? And I think the unequivocal answer to that question from people on the left has to be, yes, they do have a right to have that referendum. Now, the structural situation, whether we like it or not, is written into the Good Friday Agreement, which, by the way, I voted against, and I would vote against it again if I had the choice. It's a rotten agreement. But let's deal with the facts. The facts are that if continuous polling data and electoral data in the North shows that there's a possibility of a change of its constitutional status, then there is, the hurdle is crossed, and it's up to the British Secretary of State to decide whether to grant that or not. Now, what's been noticeable in the South in the last couple of years is quite an interesting phenomenon, that the leaders of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil parties are terrified of an end to partition. That's clear. From their point of view, the provisions written into the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 meant the question was buried and it was never going to happen. Now, I think what's changed is, first of all, the electoral facts in the North. The second thing is, which took me by surprise, but it's a reality, Brexit has changed the situation, and it's changed it in the North quite a bit, actually. Now, there's not much time here to go into it, but there has been a shift in Northern voting patterns caused by Brexit, and that is having an overspill effect on the question, on the United Ireland question. And I just finished by this. I think for the left in Ireland, and I live in Dublin, the question has to be, what kind of United Ireland do we want? Because we can't run away from the question. It's back 10, 15 years ago, it wasn't a live question. Today, it is a live question. It's especially a live one for the Northern working class, but it's also a live question for the left in the south of Ireland. The first thing that has to be done, and the most representative bits of the left in the Dáil and that's People Before Profit and a few other people on the left, is to say to Sinn Féin, yes, we agree there should be United Ireland. Yes, we agree there should be a referendum. But the real policy argument that has to be taken is, what kind of United Ireland do we want? What's the shape of it? What kind of health service? What kind of foreign policy, etc., etc. And actually, I'll finish on this. For people who want to pursue this more fully, the People Before Profit group has actually organised a conference on this for next Saturday with a broad range of speakers. And I think that's where the energies of people on the left in Ireland, and actually very much so in Britain as well, because I agree that with the prospect of the Scottish independence movement strengthening on that, it's going to give a lot more momentum to the same political movements in Ireland. And actually, which hasn't, I think, been mentioned here much, it'll, in my opinion, it'll do the same in Wales. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you, John. I have Bob Whitehead, and then I'd like to return to William and Liam to basically sum up and finish up, as well as respond as well as they can. So there'll be an extended contribution. Go ahead, Bob.
Just a very quick point. To what extent does the fact that the 26 counties not have, for example, an NHS as the rest of the UK or the England, Scotland, and Wales, and Northern Ireland do have? Is that a factor which could be used to explain the adherence of, lawless working class people towards the UK, or is that a fairly minor thing and ideology comes first?
Thank you very much, Bob. I'm going to return. Oh God, please let you be here. Oh, you're still here. Okay. I'm going to return to William and Liam, if they could respond, and they can take some time so you can sum up and as well as answer some questions. Is that okay? You can do it at least 10 minutes. Okay? Liam?
Okay, I won't take that long. I think there's a threshold for these things. I know I'm desperate to go down to the kitchen and grab a beer. Right, I want to return to something that Kieran raised, which for me is absolutely fascinating, because the period just before partition was that period of the Bolshevik Revolution, the Hungarian Revolution, the German Revolution, the Italian Revolution, and that had an impact in Ireland. Now, all over Europe, comparable workers to those in the Belfast shipyards were joining the communist parties, were putting the question of state power on the agenda. 100 years ago this week, the British state was recruiting militias because it was terrified that the triple alliance of the steel workers, the dockers, the dockers, the transport workers, and the miners were going to take large-scale joint industrial action, and they saw in that the seeds of the British Revolution, right? And the echoes of that in Belfast were very weak indeed. Yes, there were big strikes, there were elements of workers' control, but I think it was Ramsay MacDonald who was in Belfast at various points in the late teens, early 1920s. He made the absolutely accurate observation that anytime the workers come together, the orange drum is banged, and that schism in the class was used by the northern industrial bourgeoisie. So any moments that there were chances for workers' unity, the ideology of Orangism was used to destroy it, and that has happened repeatedly. So the big example that's always given of Belfast workers coming together is the outdoor relief riots in the 1930s. Well, about 2 years after that, when Protestant workers and Catholic workers marched, seized control of parts of the city, loyalists rioted against the police for progressive reasons. The leadership was elements of Belfast republicanism. Within a year or two, that class consciousness had completely evaporated, and there were new pogroms. And that's why I keep coming back to this point, that loyalism imposes a huge limit on the class consciousness of many Protestant workers, and it's done very, very deliberately. On issues of sexuality, I mean, that's been a huge change. When I was a student, you could get condoms in Belfast, you couldn't get them on the other side of the border, for example, and the levels of repressive sexual morality were extremely high, more so in the south because the church was so absolutely hegemonic. But even in the north, the Catholic Church had a huge influence. The Protestant denominations, in many respects, were just as puritanical. That influence, I think, has been probably irreversibly shattered. Definitely among Catholics, and definitely among educated Protestants and the Protestant working classes. And so now, the Pride celebrations in Belfast are some of the largest in Europe. And the class consciousness is a contradictory and complex thing. So the last one I was at, the Police Service of Northern Ireland, they'll always be the RUC to me, and the Guards were marching arm in arm at the head of in the parade, and people were applauding the cops. I don't think you would get that in London. But yeah, right, and I think that huge liberalisation that we've seen, particularly in Southern society, it is having an impact. There was quite an interesting interview with a long-standing influential DUP member saying that the 26 county state that I grew up loathing doesn't exist anymore. And I think to an extent he's right. The South is transformed beyond all recognition from the theocracy that it was. Let's see. On the question of the federal structure, well, look, the population of the whole country is about 5 million, give or take. So that's half the population of London. I think things like federal structures offer what you might call the Lebanese solution, based on sectarian head counts, patronage dispensed according to religious affiliation, sectarian identity. I think in that particular context, it's not like Australia or the United States. I think it's a very negative idea, because what it's saying is you're not a citizen, you're not a member of a class, you're a member of a religious group. As socialists, we have to reject that absolutely. And frankly, the cultural differences between the North and the South in Ireland, aren't any more significant between the more prosperous bits of northern Italy and the more rundown bits of Puglia and Sicily. It's a common language. The food's equally bad wherever you go in Ireland, and all that sort of thing. So I'd be in favour of a unitary state. And we don't call for a workers' republic because we think it's an easy demand. It's because we think it's a necessary demand, and we situate it in the context of developments in European and international politics. So, and that's the reason I'm agnostic on the question of a referendum. It may happen, it may not happen. The southern bourgeoisie is dead set against it. The unionist bourgeoisie is dead set against it. The British bourgeoisie is dead set against it. I think with that constellation of forces at the moment, it makes it a very improbable outcome. Okay. And thanks to John for reminding us for the People Before Profit event, which has the potential to be quite interesting, and I'd urge comrades to dip into it at various points. So I'd like to thank you, because I know Irish people get very carried away with all this stuff. There's a lot of history and it's very confusing sometimes, but thanks very much for engaging at such a high level. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, if I could follow what anyone can. Are you there, William? Would you like to say something good?
Yeah, I'll try and go through this as quickly as I can, because I'm mindful people are flagging. Mercedes' point about the current loyalist riots in Belfast, I certainly wouldn't attribute those to the Tories. I'll rephrase that. I don't think the Tories are allowing that to happen to distract attention from their chaotic handling of, well, where do you begin, actually, at the moment, right now. I suspect that's a result of a number of circumstances there, not just Brexit. Remember, you're dealing with some of the most impoverished areas in the United Kingdom, probably even in Europe. There's some of the lowest there's some of the lowest levels of educational attainment there, So this is a long-standing issue there, and I think Brexit is just a current focus of discontent, frankly. As regards Scottish one, it's an interesting idea to float, a union of Scotland and Northern Ireland. It's not one I've ever seen considered by anybody until now. Perhaps it's one, perhaps it's not. Again, that's for Scots and Northern Irish representatives to decide among themselves at some point. As regards, I'm going through all these as quick as I can. Sexual politics, I'll go briefly. Certainly, Partition created two states, equally socially conservative. Catholic Church from 1922 onwards dominated Irish life in a way the younger generation, North and South, just can't imagine. And censorship in Ireland was among the strictest anywhere in the world. But it's interesting how since the 60s, there's been a gradual process of liberalization, which began to pick up speed in the 70s into the 80s, and then really with the 1990s accelerated very rapidly. In no small measure to the Catholic Church's own mishandling of child abuse in its various schools and institutions. And to this day, still on the back foot with that one, I'd imagine. It's still running with the current controversy from the Magdalene laundries, mother and child homes and so on in the South. The Church's credibility as a moral teacher has taken a massive hit. So on questions of sexual politics, I really can't act really as a spokesman anymore. people decide for themselves. Marriage equality 2015, as a gay man, I thought was a brilliant thing. And I'm very proud that my own country did that, one of the very first countries in the world to do that. As regards the future Irish state, I would like to raise the point that John did. I would agree with John that really we talk about constitutions, we talk about political arrangements, when really the beauty of the Good Friday Agreement was it allowed communities to speak with each other. And if we're going to take any lesson from the period up to 1922, it's essentially what happens when there's a failure of communication, when there's a failure to understand each other, when governments don't bring peoples together to talk, when people don't learn to compromise and to listen, then I'm afraid the consequences can be quite bad. The Good Friday Agreement was an attempt to bring people together, to create, as one commentator put it recently, a creative ambiguity in which you could have a Irish and British identity, you could slip across the border. That was no bad thing in my opinion. And even with the current Brexit crisis, I still think the Good Friday Agreement is still the one way forward for progress on this island, frankly. As regards the federal solution, I take Liam's point, but if we're talking about a united state of Ireland, we are going to face the problem of a large minority that may never be happy. And you try and create perhaps some structures, whether they're federal, whether they're other, that will allow them to feel confident in that state, that they can have that identity in that state. And perhaps I'll float this out as a controversial comment at the end. Maybe a united Ireland can join the Commonwealth, give the Unionists some kind of link to the home country or whatever, and let them have that option. If it brings United Ireland, I'm happy with that one. And let's work for a socialist republic through the ballot box over time. That's how I'll end.
Thank you so much to Liam and William. I mean, everybody's participation. Thank you very much for all the excellent discussions and debate. The ACR wants to thank you. We really appreciate it. We'll be posting the talk on our YouTube channel and the website tomorrow. And if you aren't a member of Anti-Capitalist Resistance, please think of joining. The link is inside the chat that Simon posted. And we're also, the ACR is involved with the Kill the Bill protests on the 1st of May, and will be participating with the coalition. So we'll keep people updated on what comrades are doing. So thank you very much to everybody. Please go check the People for Profit link that was put up by John Meehan. And thanks everybody once again. And everybody have a good night. And thanks everybody, comrades.
Thank you.
Thank you.